On the morning of August 7, 1942, cryptanalyst Captain Takeshi Yamamoto sat in a cramped listening station on Rabaul Island, his headphones pressed tight against his ears as he transcribed what should have been routine American radio traffic. Instead, what emerged from the static was unlike anything he had encountered in 3 years of intercepting Allied communications. The sounds were guttural, rhythmic, completely alien to any language in his extensive training. He believed he was listening to a new mechanical encryption device, perhaps the most sophisticated the Americans had yet deployed. He was catastrophically wrong. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you are watching from. It really helps support the channel. What Captain Yamamoto had stumbled upon would become one of the most frustrating mysteries of the Pacific conflict, a code that would remain unbroken throughout the entire war, despite the legendary skills of Japanese cryptanalysis teams. The story of how a group of Navajo men created an unbreakable cipher using their native language, and the dawning horror among Japanese intelligence as they realized what they were facing, reveals the power of cultural uniqueness in warfare and the limits of even the most sophisticated code-breaking operations. The Japanese imperial forces entered the Pacific conflict with perhaps the finest signals intelligence apparatus in the world. Their cryptanalysis teams had achieved remarkable successes, breaking American, British, and Dutch codes with disturbing regularity. The Japanese Type B cipher machine, which Allied forces called Purple, had been considered unbreakable by its designers, yet American cryptanalysts had cracked it before the war even began. The Japanese knew their opponents possessed similar capabilities. What they did not know was that the Americans were about to deploy something that existed outside the entire framework of conventional cryptography. In Tokyo, at the Communications Intelligence Center, Colonel Masanobu Tsuji oversaw teams of linguists who collectively spoke 43 languages and dialects. These men had been recruited from universities across the Japanese Empire, trained in linguistic analysis, frequency patterns, and the mathematical foundations of code breaking. They had successfully penetrated American codes throughout 1941 and into early 1942, providing Japanese commanders with crucial intelligence about American ship movements, supply routes, and operational planning. The Americans knew their codes were compromised, which made the situation increasingly desperate. The problem was fundamental to the nature of warfare in the Pacific. Radio communication was essential for coordinating operations across vast oceanic distances, but any radio transmission could be intercepted. Traditional codes could be broken given enough time and intercepted messages. Even one-time cipher pads, theoretically unbreakable, were vulnerable to capture or compromise. Military planners needed something different, something that could be transmitted quickly in combat situations without requiring encryption machines or codebooks that might fall into enemy hands. The solution came from an unlikely source. Philip Johnston was a civil engineer living in Los Angeles, the son of missionaries who had spent his childhood on Navajo reservations. He had grown up speaking Navajo as fluently as English, one of fewer than 30 non-Navajos in the entire world who could make that claim. In February 1942, Johnston read a newspaper article about an armored division using Native American languages for communications in a Louisiana training exercise. The article mentioned the experiment had been deemed interesting, but impractical. Johnston knew better. He understood something that few outside the Navajo nation realized. The Navajo language was extraordinarily complex, with syntax and tonal qualities unlike any language in Europe or Asia. It had no alphabet, no written form that outsiders could study. Its grammar was so intricate that adult learners rarely achieved fluency. Most importantly, it was spoken by perhaps fewer than 30,000 people, almost all of whom lived in the American Southwest, making it virtually impossible for Japanese intelligence to access native speakers for translation or analysis. Johnston brought his idea to Lieutenant Colonel James Jones at Camp Elliott, near San Diego. Jones was skeptical. The military had experimented with Native American languages during the First World War, using Choctaw, Comanche, and other tribal languages for battlefield communications. The experiments had shown promise, but were never formalized into official doctrine. Jones worried that any native language could be learned by determined enemy linguists, especially with the resources available to Japanese intelligence services. Johnston made a simple demonstration. He brought 2 Navajo men to Camp Elliott and had them transmit messages across the base, while Jones and his intelligence officers attempted to understand anything from the intercepted transmissions. Even knowing the messages were in Navajo and having Johnston provide grammatical information, the military linguists could make no sense of the flowing, clicking, guttural sounds. The language resisted analysis in ways that left the trained cryptographers frustrated and amazed. The Marine Corps authorized a pilot program. In May 1942, 29 young Navajo men reported to boot camp at Camp Elliott. They ranged in age from 18 to 35. Many had left the reservation for the first time. Some had attended boarding schools where speaking Navajo had been forbidden, where they had been punished for using their native language. Now the same military that had once attempted to erase their linguistic heritage was asking them to weaponize it. The challenge they faced was more complex than simply speaking Navajo on the radio. Military terminology had no equivalent in the Navajo language. There were no Navajo words for tank, submarine, fighter plane, or amphibious assault. The language had evolved in the high desert of the American Southwest, describing a world of sheep, hogans, sacred mountains, and clan relationships. The original 29 recruits, who would later be called the Navajo Code Talkers, had to create an entirely new military vocabulary while developing a system that could be transmitted rapidly under combat conditions. Their solution was ingenious and multi-layered. For military terms, they used Navajo words that captured the essence or appearance of modern weapons. A bomber became Jaysho, the Navajo word for buzzard. A fighter plane became Dahitihi, meaning hummingbird. A battleship was Lotso, or whale. Submarines became Beshlo, ironfish. Bombs were Ayeshi, eggs. The poetic logic was distinctly Navajo, drawing connections between the natural world and military hardware in ways that were culturally meaningful but utterly opaque to outsiders. For spelling out names, coordinates, or other information that required letter-by-letter transmission, they developed an alphabet based on Navajo words. A became Wolachi, ant. B became Shush, bear. C became Moasi, cat. Each letter had a corresponding Navajo word, and they memorized alternatives for frequently used letters to prevent pattern recognition. The system was elegant, fast, and unlike anything in the history of military communications. They trained relentlessly. The Navajo language is verb-centered, with complex conjugations that change meaning through subtle tonal shifts. A slight variation in pitch or duration could transform a word about a sheep into a word about a ceremonial song. The code talkers had to achieve perfect accuracy while transmitting under conditions of extreme stress, often while under hostile action. They practiced until they could encode, transmit, and decode a 3-line English message in 20 seconds, a process that took 30 minutes using existing encryption machines. By August 1942, the first Navajo code talkers deployed to Guadalcanal. The operation to secure the island was among the first major American offensives in the Pacific, a brutal campaign that would last 6 months and test every aspect of American military capability. Japanese forces had established a significant presence on the island, including a nearly completed airfield that threatened Allied supply lines throughout the South Pacific. The invasion force included over 10,000 Marines who would need constant communication with ships offshore and with each other as they advanced through dense jungle terrain. Captain Yamamoto and his team at Rabaul intercepted the first Navajo transmissions during the initial landing operations. The Japanese listening posts were equipped with the finest radio receivers available, sensitive enough to pick up transmissions across hundreds of miles of ocean. Their operators were trained to recognize the cadence and structure of American military communications. They knew the standard call signs, the typical message formats, the characteristic patterns of American radio operators. What they heard from Guadalcanal matched none of their expectations. The transmissions were clearly voice communications, not mechanical encryption. The speakers were obviously trained operators who followed military protocol for call signs and message formatting. But the language itself was completely unrecognizable. Yamamoto made extensive recordings, transcribing phonetically what he heard. He sent priority reports to Tokyo describing the new American system, requesting immediate analysis by the Communications Intelligence Center. In Tokyo, Colonel Tsuji assembled his best linguistic analysts. They listened to the recordings repeatedly, attempting to identify any familiar phonemes, any recognizable grammatical structures, any cognates with known languages. Their initial assumption was that the Americans were using some Pacific Island language, perhaps recruiting native speakers from territories recently under American control. They compared the recordings against samples of Polynesian languages, Micronesian dialects, indigenous languages from the Philippines and Indonesia. Nothing matched. One analyst thought he detected tonal patterns similar to Chinese. Another believed he heard clicking sounds reminiscent of certain African languages. A linguist who had studied Native American languages wondered if it might be an indigenous American tongue, but quickly dismissed the idea as impractical. Surely the Americans would not use a language spoken by their own suppressed minority populations. The Japanese intelligence community knew about American Indian reservations, about the historical conflicts between the United States government and indigenous peoples. The idea that America would entrust crucial military communications to native people seemed unlikely, bordering on impossible. As weeks passed and more transmissions were intercepted, the Japanese became increasingly frustrated. They could identify when major operations were being planned because radio traffic increased. They could track general movement patterns by noting which stations were transmitting to which receivers. But they could understand absolutely nothing about the content of the messages. It was as if the Americans had developed a form of communication that existed outside the boundaries of human language, as Japanese linguists understood it. What made the situation particularly maddening was that the Japanese could break every other American code. They continued to successfully intercept and decrypt messages using standard American cipher systems. They could read communications between naval vessels, supply requisitions, casuarial reports from field commanders who did not have access to Navajo code talkers. But whenever the mysterious language appeared, usually during crucial combat operations, they encountered an impenetrable wall of incomprehensible sounds. The Japanese tried multiple approaches to solve the problem. They assigned their best linguists to listen to nothing but these mysterious transmissions, hoping that prolonged exposure would reveal patterns or repeated phrases that could serve as cribs for breaking the code. They captured American radio equipment, thinking perhaps the transmissions were being mechanically altered in some way their receivers could not properly decode. They interrogated captured American personnel about the new communication system, though most Marines knew nothing about the Navajo program, and those who did had been instructed to reveal nothing. Meanwhile, the code talkers proved themselves invaluable in combat. At Guadalcanal, Major General Alexander Vandergrift, commander of the 1st Marine Division, initially regarded the Navajo program as an interesting experiment of uncertain value. His skepticism evaporated during the first major operation, where code talkers coordinated troop movements. Messages that would have taken hours to encode and decode using cipher machines were transmitted in minutes with perfect accuracy. Commanders could communicate tactical changes in real time, responding to developing situations with a speed that gave American forces a crucial advantage. The code talkers operated under extraordinary pressure. They were prime targets for Japanese forces who quickly realized that these particular Marines were somehow crucial to American communications. Several code talkers reported close encounters where they had been specifically targeted. Ironically, they also faced danger from American troops who sometimes mistook them for Japanese soldiers due to their Asian features. Some code talkers were assigned bodyguards, though officially this was for their protection from enemy action rather than from friendly fire incidents. As the war progressed through 1943, the code talkers participated in every major marine operation in the Pacific: Tarawa, Peleliu, Guam, Saipan, Iwo Jima, Okinawa. At each landing, Navajo voices filled the radio networks, directing artillery fire, calling for supplies, coordinating troop movements. The original 29 code talkers were joined by hundreds more. By the end of the conflict, more than 400 Navajos had served in the program. They transmitted thousands of messages without a single error that resulted from code failure or misunderstanding. The Japanese never stopped trying to break the code. In late 1943, a fortunate capture brought them a potential breakthrough. An American patrol was ambushed near Bougainville, and among the casualties was a Navajo Marine. The Japanese soldiers who found his body discovered documents that identified him as part of a special communications unit. This information was relayed to intelligence headquarters with high priority. Japanese interrogators were brought in to question survivors from the same unit, though these prisoners knew only that certain Marines transmitted in a language they did not recognize. The breakthrough came when Japanese intelligence analysts cross-referenced reports from all theaters of operation and realized that the mysterious language appeared only in Marine Corps communications, never in Army or Navy transmissions. This suggested a specialized program rather than a broadly implemented system. They began investigating languages indigenous to areas where Marines typically recruited. A linguist named Toshiro Watanabe, who had studied linguistics at the University of California before the war, suggested that the language might be Native American. He was familiar with the diversity of indigenous American languages and knew that some were extraordinarily complex. He proposed that the Marines might be using one of the more obscure tribal languages, something so rare that Japanese intelligence would have no access to speakers. This theory was correct but useless. Even identifying the language family did nothing to help decrypt the messages. North America had hundreds of indigenous languages, many with only hundreds or thousands of speakers. Japanese intelligence had no way to determine which specific language was being used, no access to linguistic resources that might help them understand its structure, and no realistic possibility of capturing or recruiting a speaker who could serve as a translator. In desperation, Japanese intelligence attempted one final strategy. They knew that the American government had operated Indian boarding schools for decades, institutions designed to assimilate native children into mainstream American culture. Some of these schools had been run by missionaries, including Japanese Christian missionaries. If they could locate Japanese citizens who had worked at these schools, who might have learned indigenous languages during their service, perhaps they could finally crack the code. They found several Japanese nationals who had taught at Indian schools in the American Southwest during the 1920s and 30s. These individuals were brought to Tokyo and played recordings of the intercepted transmissions. One former missionary named Kenji Sasaki listened intently to several recordings before announcing that he recognized the language. It was Navajo, he said, a language he had studied for 3 years while working at a mission school in Arizona. The revelation was simultaneously triumphant and devastating. Sasaki explained that Navajo was among the most difficult languages on Earth for adult learners. Its grammar was nothing like Japanese, English, or any Asian language. It used tones to distinguish meaning, but in ways completely different from Chinese or Thai. It had sounds that required tongue positions and throat movements that Japanese speakers found almost impossible to produce. Most crushing of all, Sasaki admitted that despite 3 years of immersion and study, he could understand only simple, everyday conversations. The military terminology, the rapid combat pace of the transmissions, and the deliberately modified vocabulary rendered the messages completely incomprehensible to him. Japanese intelligence made one last attempt. They brought Sasaki to a listening post and had him work with their best cryptanalysts, combining his limited Navajo knowledge with their skills in pattern recognition and linguistic analysis. For weeks, the team labored over recordings, attempting to build a vocabulary list, to identify repeated phrases, to find some entry point into the code. They made almost no progress. The few words Sasaki could identify were usually the Navajo names for animals or natural features: buzzard, hummingbird, whale, ironfish, but these meant nothing without context. Why were the Americans talking about buzzards and whales during jungle combat operations? The poetic logic of the Navajo military vocabulary remained opaque. The realization spread through Japanese intelligence circles like a slow poison. They possessed perhaps the finest signals intelligence organization in the Pacific. They had broken American diplomatic codes before the war began. They had penetrated British and Dutch military communications, They had cryptanalysts who could detect patterns in seemingly random number sequences, linguists who spoke dozens of languages, mathematicians who understood the deepest principles of code theory, and yet they were completely helpless against a code that required no machines, no cipher books, no complex mathematics. They were defeated by the simple fact of linguistic diversity, by a language that had evolved in isolation for thousands of years in a remote corner of the American Southwest. By 1944, Japanese intelligence had largely abandoned efforts to break the Navajo code. They continued to intercept and record the transmissions, hoping that eventually some breakthrough would emerge, but they devoted their primary resources to other intelligence targets. In classified reports, Japanese analysts referred to the Navajo transmissions as the unbreakable American code, acknowledging a defeat that was particularly bitter because it represented a type of superiority they had not anticipated. Japanese forces had prepared for technological warfare, for battles of production capacity and mechanical innovation. They had not prepared to face an enemy who could weaponize the very diversity that made America seem culturally weak. The code talkers themselves were unaware of the extent of their success until after the war. They knew their transmissions were secure because commanders told them so, and because Japanese forces never seemed to anticipate operations that had been discussed over Navajo encrypted networks. But the full story of Japanese frustration remained classified for decades. The American military, recognizing that the Navajo code might be valuable in future conflicts, maintained strict secrecy about the program even after the war ended. For the Navajo Marines who served as code talkers, the irony of their situation was not lost. Many had attended the same boarding schools that had tried to eliminate their language, schools where children were punished for speaking Navajo, where the explicit goal was to make indigenous people more like white Americans. Now the military was celebrating the very cultural uniqueness those schools had tried to destroy. The code talkers took pride in their contribution, but they also understood the complex history that made their service both heroic and bittersweet. The war ended in August 1945 without Japanese cryptanalysts ever breaking the Navajo code. In post-war interrogations, captured Japanese intelligence officers spoke with a mixture of respect and frustration about the American communication system they had never understood. Some expressed admiration for the elegant simplicity of using a natural language as an encryption system. Others remained bitter about a defeat that seemed to violate the logic of modern warfare. How could the side with superior technology and training be defeated by something as primitive as an obscure tribal language? The answer revealed something profound about the nature of security in an interconnected world. The most sophisticated codes could be broken by sufficiently advanced mathematics and powerful computing resources. The most complex cipher machines could be stolen or compromised, but a language embedded in a specific culture, shaped by thousands of years of isolation, carrying within its structure worldviews and logical patterns unique to a particular people, that could not be broken by any amount of technological superiority or analytical skill. The Navajo code talkers had weaponized cultural diversity itself, turning what American society had long viewed as a liability into a decisive strategic advantage. In 1946, as soldiers returned home and the apparatus of war was dismantled, the Navajo code talkers went back to reservations in New Mexico, Arizona, and Utah. They could not discuss what they had done. The program remained classified. They received no special recognition, no public acknowledgement of their contribution. Many struggled to reintegrate into civilian life, carrying experiences they could not share even with family members. Some faced discrimination in the same communities they had helped defend. The paradox of their situation, celebrated in secret, marginalized in public, reflected the broader contradictions of American society at mid-century. It was not until 1968 that the Navajo code was declassified, and not until the 1980s that code talkers began receiving broader public recognition. By then, many of the original 29 had passed away. Those who lived to see their story told publicly spoke of their service with characteristic Navajo modesty, emphasizing the collective effort rather than individual heroism. They had done what was asked of them, they said, using what they had been given, A language, a culture, a way of seeing the world that happened to be exactly what their country needed at a crucial moment. The Japanese cryptanalysts who spent the war trying to break the Navajo code rarely spoke publicly about their failure. In the professional culture of signals intelligence, where success is measured by secrets revealed and codes broken, the Navajo code represented an absolute defeat. But privately, some expressed a kind of reluctant admiration. They had been beaten by something they had not known existed, defeated by diversity they had not known could be weaponized. In a war characterized by industrial production, technological innovation, and mechanical efficiency, the decisive intelligence advantage had gone to the side that embraced the value of the apparently obsolete, the supposedly primitive, the culturally unique. The story of what Japanese codebreakers said when they discovered American Marines were using Navajo speakers is ultimately a story of frustrated respect. Initial confusion gave way to determined effort, which yielded to grudging acknowledgement of an unsolvable problem. The language they heard in their headphones was not just a code. It was the voice of a people whose cultural persistence had made them invaluable at the very moment when their society treated them as marginal. The code talkers spoke in their native language and created an unbreakable cipher, not through technological sophistication, but through the simple fact of being who they were, speaking as they had always spoken, carrying forward a linguistic heritage that had survived centuries of pressure to assimilate and disappear. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.